So I'm going to talk about American decline and rise of China, probably a slightly shorter version than what I prepared, so sort of hopefully lots of things to discussion. Two quick caveats to start with. Firstly, is I'm going to be covering a very wide area in quite a long period of time, so it's going to be quite general, missing out a lot of things. So, asking discussion. In particular, I'm going to be missing out detail about American decline. I'm sort of taking for granted that we know about that America is declining power in the world, and I'm going to concentrate on China. And I'm also going to concentrate on the bigger picture of China's relations with the world, and especially with the USA, rather than what's happening within China, except where it directly relates. But I have to start with Hong Kong. Firstly, because it's one of the most inspiring struggles taking place anywhere in the world at the moment. There were today, despite the banning of the march and the arrests of some dozen leading figures in the movement, there were tens of thousands of people out across the centre of Hong Kong. The movement has not gone away. And I'm not going to talk in any detail about it, but rather just refer people to Colin Sparks' excellent pieces on the website. But it's important not because it's a product of tensions between China and America. It's not. It's about how Hong Kong, inside there are economic roots. It's about how Hong Kong has become less important to China as a whole, but rather because it shows how social movements and class struggle can upset rules plans. Because too often when we talk about the world economy, imperialism, it's all about what they're doing. It's all about their plans, their conflicts with each other, which sort of assumes that we sit down and we take it, which unfortunately most of the time we do. Hong Kong shows what happens when people stop taking it, and that's a very important point to bear in mind. So where I want to begin is really to say that China represents an economic, political and military challenge to American imperialism that America has never faced since it became the dominant world imperialist power. In the period of the Cold War, after the Second World War, there were economic challenges, in particular from Germany and Japan, but the whole of the Western world was essentially united underneath American military leadership and to a great extent American political leadership. They faced military competition on the swords from Russia, the Warsaw Pact, China, but there was no sort of sense of economic competition. This is something new. It's important to bear in mind that there are huge differences still remain. When we talk about Chinese military competition with USA, for instance, what that simply means is that America can't do anything it likes anymore in East Asia because it has to take cognizance of what China does. It's pushing at what the Americans are pushing at what the limits of that are all the time. The other day they flew a fighter plane down the border, the sea border between China and Taiwan, effectively seeing if someone from the Chinese side would be stupid enough to fire on them. So those sorts of minor provocations happen all the time. But there is still that sense that China has become a military competitor. Of course, politically and economically, it's far more important. And it's also important to bear in mind that this has ratcheted up several notches since about 2010, with China now actively challenging American hegemony over the world political order, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So, China is now the second biggest economy in the world. It's the biggest exporter in the world. It's the fifth biggest source of foreign direct investment into the rest of Asia, Africa, Latin America. It's also the world's second biggest importer. Crucially, China's growth since 1990 has been dependent on its insertion into the world economy and its relationships with the world economy. And it's important to remember how recent that was. As of 1990, so 12 years after the economic changes started, as of 1990, China accounted for 2% of the world's GDP. And the majority of its trade was with Hong Kong, and most of the rest of it was with other countries in Asia. So that growth has been very, very quick, and that makes it both very dynamic, but also quite unstable. And in the 1990s and earlier, this century. That growth was basically built on exporting to the USA, to a less extent to Western Europe, fueled by what seemed like an unending supply of cheap labour coming into the new cities from the countryside. And even before the 2008 collapse, that model was unsustainable, although very few Western commentators could see it at the time. But there were people inside the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party who could see that the model was unsustainable, that they were too reliant on exporting to the States. 2008 saw a massive economic dip across the rest of the world. It also saw a huge economic dip in China, with, on one estimate, some 25 million people losing their jobs in the exporting factories. People turning to work to find that the factories had just been locked over the weekend, or sometimes not even locked, sometimes the employers just walked away. There's a wonderful picture of the time of a bloke with a fang in his mouth, walking out of the factory with a pallet on each shoulder, because everything else had already been taken. That collapse was incredibly sudden. The response of the Chinese state was also equally sudden. They pushed forward very quickly a huge program of investment in infrastructure, roads, airports, ports, what have you, in order both to sort of do something about the unemployment, but also, more importantly, to shore up China's key state-owned industries, steel industry, cement industry, and so on and so forth. And they did that by huge amounts of state borrowing. And that stabilised employment and industrial demand, but again, it was a stopgap. It couldn't be a long-term plan. I mean, one of the things that sticks in my mind from period is that, you know, a year or so into that, they were building 8 commercial airports in the area between Hong Kong and the capital of the neighbouring province, which is from here to Birmingham. That's 8 commercial airports on top of the ones that already existed. That speed of investment isn't sustainable in the long run. What they have now, which they think looks much more sustainable, is what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but basically this is a massive infrastructure building program with plans to work in about 60 countries across the rest of Asia, into Europe, the north part of Africa, now moving into Caribbean, with allowing for inflation 7 times what the USA spent on the Marshall Plan in Western Europe after World War II. So it's, as a global project, possibly the single most ambitious thing that capitalism has ever done. And it is very explicitly something that aims at recentering the world economy, or rather moving the centre of the world economy away from away from the USA. There's a variety of maps about how the scheme works, and honestly, it changes all the time as they add bits on, but this graphic gives you a sense of what's going on. There are now moves to put something into, as I say, something into Caribbean, something into Latin America, but it's basically this is a world where America is off to the side, and that's matched by economic initiatives such as the Asian Investment Development Bank and the Chinese Investment Bank, which are explicitly posited as alternatives to the World Bank, and political and military initiatives such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is basically every Asian government getting together to talk about military and political interests that they have in common, so an incredibly Islamophobic movement, but also again one that explicitly says what happens in Asia is decided by Asians. The Americans have no part of it. So, but at this point, it's necessary to pause a little minute, because while what China's doing is a challenge to the hegemony of US imperialism, it's not a challenge to the structures of domination and inequality that define imperialism as a whole. It's a shifting in the balance of the way that imperialism as a world system is configured. Now, imperialism is a term that's much more widely understood, much more widely used than it used to be 20, 30 years ago, but it's important to go beyond the everyday definition of imperialism being America invading countries and Britain going along with it. Imperialism is a world system essentially about the coming together of capital and governments, the necessity of capital to go beyond its national boundaries, both for markets, but also for raw materials and components, and consequently a fusing together of the interests of capital and the interests of the nation state in competing with each other. And one of the key things about that is that imperialism always exists as rival imperialist powers. So even at the height of American domination, in 1991, after the USSR had imploded, there was still British imperialism, still German imperialism, still French imperialism. Now what we're seeing is the rise of Chinese imperialism and the rise of Chinese imperialism as a threat, say, to American hegemony. But it's also important to say that China behaves in the world in much the same way as other imperialist powers have behaved in the past. Not worse, but just in the same way. So if you look at Chinese investment across Africa, across Latin America, it's about primary commodities. It's about, in some cases, pushing backwards the development of those development of those countries. For time, I'll just talk about Brazil. China is now Brazil's biggest trading partner. 70% of Brazil's exports to China are iron ore and soybeans. The impact of that has been that that industry has actually declined as a proportion of the Brazilian economy. The Brazilian economy being the most industrialised economy anywhere in Latin America. And of course it's a direct contributor to the attacks on the Amazon rainforest and to the fires in the Amazon rainforest. We see some of those fires are quite specifically to clear land in order to grow more soybeans in order to sell to China. Bolsonaro used the spectre of Chinese imperialism as a populist tool in his election campaign, but he's now had to back off. One of his first foreign visits abroad is going to be in China. Is going to be China later this year. There are numerous other examples: iron ore in Australia, Chile in copper, oil in Sudan and Angola. But broadly speaking, where China goes in the world, it's primarily interested in extracting raw materials, extracting particular energy, and in the process will quite happily militarily prop up some of the worst dictators. They're not looking for dictatorships, except in the sense that a lot of the energy resources are in countries where the West has effectively pulled out of, like Angola, for instance, or Sudan. And so the stuff is there, and it's there for taking, and it's there for taking very, very cheap. But there's also a shift with the Belt and Road Initiative, because the Belt and Road Initiative is about both expanding Chinese political influence, but it's also about putting to use the huge dollar mountains that China are looking on, and thus it has to pay for itself in a way that some of the previous investments haven't already done. This has led to a series of conflicts with a number of countries in Pakistan. The Pakistani government has pulled out of an agreement to build dams because the Chinese government was asking for too much money. In Sri Lanka, a business deal went so badly wrong that the Sri Lankan government had to give the Chinese government a major port as part of the settlement deal. China has also now established a military base in Djibouti. So it has a toehold in Africa. The Chinese state-owned company has also taken over the port of Piraeus in Greece, which went bankrupt and carried on with exactly the same program of redundancies that the previous owners carried. So absolutely, it is not an alternative. So I'll come now to Trump's trade wars. One of Trump's key campaign promises was getting tough on China. Whatever else he's failed to do, he's delivered on that. And the most recent one was the tweet where he ordered, as president, American companies to withdraw from China, which prompted a sort of slightly panicky detailed article in the New York Times saying, oh my God, can he do that? Which sort of concluded that yes, possibly it would be tied up in the courts for years. So it's not quite as absurd as it looks here, because the executive powers that have been given to the president through the years of the stuff around the war on terror have actually meant that it's not something that American companies can simply dismiss as, oh, this is complete nonsense. So the imposition of punitive tariffs on China has been going on for about a year, followed all the time as each round goes in. It's followed by retaliation from China, and they are essentially locked into a battle where I think both Trump and Xi Jinping would like to stop, but politically, Trump needs to stop at a point where he registers a clear victory. Xi Jinping also needs to stop at a point where he registers a clear victory. And so if neither of them is going to back down, this is likely to continue. Now this is hurting overall the Chinese economy at the moment more than it is the States. The Chinese economy has been slowing down for a couple of years anyway, although when we say it's slowing down, the Chinese economy has now slowed down to a growth rate of something like 6% per year, which most Western politicians would still sell their grandmothers for. So, but in terms of the growth rates in China sort of a decade ago, when they were sort of touching almost double that, it's a very important move back. But one of the things to grasp about this is it sometimes poses sort of Trump is completely irrational, that there is the interests of American capitalism are here, and Trump is doing this out of pure ideology against the interests of American capitalism, and there will be a conflict. And I think we have to understand that what Trump's doing is rational from the point of view of sections of American capital, because China's rise has been a help to large parts of American capital in many ways. Cheap consumer goods have helped prop up a sluggish and credit-driven growth rate. American companies have benefited hugely from being able to expand production in China. Apple, for instance, which has its stuff produced by a company called Foxconn, the largest Foxconn, I'm not sure what you call it, campus in China, employs 400,000 people on one site, and it's not the only site. So, you couldn't do that anywhere in the States, anywhere in the Western world, pretty much anywhere else except China. So Apple's growth has been because it's been able to invest so heavily in China. Walmart has boomed because of the supply of cheap consumer goods that can sell to people. Whole set, and numerous other sections of American capital have boomed. If you're American capital that doesn't export and doesn't, however, or doesn't rely on outsourced production, then Chinese competition has been a very bad thing. So Chinese competition has been a very bad thing for large parts of the steel industry. And of course, it's been for some bits of American capital, it's been both at once. And the obvious example of this is Microsoft. On the other hand, on one hand, Microsoft's stated aim of a PC on every desk, and the opening up of the Chinese economy, meaning the booming in the number of computers that needed Microsoft technology, a wonderful growth. On the other hand, part of the growth, spectacular growth in China over the last 20 years, has been a boom in pirate software. China is on, one of the places in which China leads the world is in pirated Microsoft software, which is, available for about 10% of the price factor of Microsoft software. So that, on one hand, that has also undermined Microsoft at the same time. It's pushed it. And Trump's China bashing also works politically because they have been hearing from American union leaders for 20 years now that their jobs are being lost because their bosses are exporting their jobs to China. The nationalism that comes out of American trade unions has to be seen to be believed, but that has helped Trump to fuel that sort of, to fuel that internationalism. And of course the biggest effects are likely to be felt by those economies in the crossfire, because the world economy was, before this started, the world economy was slowing down anyway. The fact that the Chinese economy is now contracting, that there are these trade wars, means that other economies, particularly in Southeast Asia, are going to be hit both from both sides. And what we're seeing is fundamental strains against the neoliberal ideology that has dominated the world economy for much of the last 30 years. Now, this isn't necessarily to be welcomed. You know, Bolsonaro's opposition to neoliberalism is not because he believes in a fairer, nicer, gentler capitalism. It's because it doesn't. It's because he thinks Brazilian capitalism needs to be more aggressive in favour of the slowdown. The same can be said for Modi. The same can be said. The same can be said for Trump. And nor are things necessarily better if the state has a much stronger hold of the economy, and China is obviously a prime example of that. But I want to finish because all of that is, if you like, fairly simple, fairly straightforward. It's quite easy to document talking about China's imperialism and how China behaves. The problem is that we're not the only people who are talking about Chinese imperialism, who are using the expression about Chinese imperialism. So, for instance, quote from Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican leader in the Senate. So, if Trump and Pence both fell under a bus, he's the bloke who would be the next president. So he's not, so nobody. Sooner or later, the rest of the world will have to do what the protesters in Hong Kong are doing: confront Beijing. I read that in the same week as a report that the FBI is routinely harassing Chinese academics in the States who are working in the scientific and technical areas on the assumption that any Chinese national who is at an American university may well be a spy for China. And therefore they're directly harassing people, they're asking them to inform on their co-workers, they're specifically targeting people before China. In Australia, at the University of Queensland, the organisation around Hong Kong saw a rally of Hong Kong students and people supporting them, which was opposed by a larger rally of some 300 pro-Beijing Chinese students. This was then used as an excuse by the far right to launch a rally on the university campus against Chinese interference in Australian politics, at which there were speakers from the Australian Labour Party and the Australian Greens. Now, the Australian Labour Party are way to the right of the Labour Party here. It's unthinkable you get a Corbyn figure out of the Australian Labour Party, and the Greens similarly have been deeply compromised by years of being in struggle. But nevertheless, it showed how that idea of Chinese competition, Chinese influence, Chinese domination can be taken up by the right wing as well. And similarly, if anyone saw the programme on BBC Two on Thursday night, that was very much the same sort of China is coming, China is a threat, China is a menace. Now, anti-Chinese racism doesn't have the long history and the roots here that it does in Australia or in America, but nevertheless, it's still something that our rulers think they can use. So we need to think about how we talk about this. And back in the 1940s, American socialists coined the phrase neither Washington nor Moscow, which is sort of something we said an awful lot during the Cold War, and sort of dropped after the Cold War because we thought it wasn't going to be necessary anymore. I think the rise of China means we have to start thinking through that lens again. Not that it's an answer, it's not a slogan, it's never an answer, but it's a way of starting to think about when we talk about opposing Chinese imperialism, we're talking about it because we impose imperialism, not because it's Chinese. In the same way as when we talk about what Israel does in the West Bank, in Gaza, in occupied Palestine itself. It's not because it's Jewish people doing it, it's because it's imperialism, it's because it's settler colonialism. So we have to be very, very clear that what we're opposing is imperialism, and therefore we start by saying we oppose our own imperialism. China is a component of a world system in which the British government, American government, is every bit as complicit as America. Chinese imperialism isn't worse, it's just new, it's different, but it's inserting into an old system that we want to try and pull down. It's like Ian said, the rules of globalization and sort of neoliberalism applies to governments and sort of basically, I mean, it's contradictory because neoliberalism is always about what governments do. It's usually about governments doing less. And the rules were basically that the rules of the world economy and the flattening out of the world economy favoured the strongest powers. What you've had in different, and as Ian said, that was fine for America when they were absolutely the strongest power. Now that China is rising, and China has used exactly those rules set up by those structures of the world economy to get to the point where it's now disadvantageous for America to stick to those, and it's possible to whip up a right-wing populism by saying, basically the government should be doing more to protect you against foreigners, in a broad sweep, very broad sweep, Bolsonaro and Modi fall in different ways into that same sort of mould. The reassertion of nationalism, the reassertion of I will make you better off by making the nation more important. It's that there's an economic edge to that populism, which is quite important. Which means that yes, you do go to not exactly Keynesianism as such, but to sort of saying, well, if free trade isn't always to our advantage, then let's not have free trade. Let's make rules about what the government can and can't do in investing in this industry, investing in that industry. Let's, in particular, what all three of them very definitely united by, are pushing back against the ecological restrictions on development that, if you like, had come out of what world consensus there was about climate change. We sort of ought to try and, however liberal and woolly it is, we ought to try and cut down oil production, we ought to try and cut down on use of energy, we ought to try and not cut down the rainforests. And Bolsonaro and Trump in particular are quite explicitly, no, this gets in the way of what we want to do, and therefore we are going to explicitly, which goes along with sort of very explicit climate change denial. Modi's sort of slightly less around that. He's much more around, and in a sense it's much more for Modi around asserting Hindu domination over India as a whole. So it's much more, for Modi it's much more about the enemy within in terms of the Muslim population. But yes, that's basically the idea, that the sort of the way the world economy is structured disadvantages these economies, and therefore you can get right-wing populists who kick back against that. I think, and that sort of, to a large extent, comes back to this point that we are very definitely entering a new period in which, as an Australian friend of mine wrote something a couple of years back in which he sort of half jokingly said, let's stop using the word neoliberalism, because it means so many different things to so many different people that it's become not very useful as a term of analysis anymore. And I think he took it a bit too far. But there has been a tendency over the left to sort of conflate talking about the way we talk about neoliberalism, the way we talk about capitalism, or even worse, to talk about neoliberalism, the problem as being neoliberalism, as in the way capitalism has been over the last 30 years. And if we could only go back to the way capitalism was before neoliberalism, with states running economies, then everything will be fine. We are moving into a new world. We are moving into, I think, a new world where some of the old certainties of neoliberalism and globalisation are going to be challenged. That's not necessarily one, and that is going to mean a greater assertion of the importance of states in directing the economy. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a nicer phase of capitalism by any means. And the last thing I guess about that is sort of, Ian said sort of in the Cold War it was relatively clear. Well, it is in hindsight, and it was to us, but of course the reason that, in the 1960s and 1970s, the IS tendency we came out of were known as the state caps, was that we were pretty much on our own in saying Russia's imperialist, on our own on the left. And for the vast majority of the left, Russia was preferred over America. China was preferred over America. Eastern Europe was preferred over America. And you're right, we are seeing a revival of that, and I think in a more degenerate form, because when it was argued in the 60s and 70s, I remember my dad telling me that Russia was a nice place where everyone had a council house and everyone had a job and no one went hungry. And that was the common sense view of huge numbers of Labour Party members, far beyond that you look to China and Russia, what have you, because these were better places, whatever the actual reality. The Modi, the Trump worship, the China worship now actually doesn't have that. It's just about power. It's just about, anything is preferable to American imperialism. And it's, there's no attempt to sort of say that Chinese people are better off or Russian people are better off. It's better to have this government than it is to have that government. So that has obviously implications when people kick off against governments that are not supported by the USA, because you've got people on the left, for instance, saying about Hong Kong that the movement in Hong Kong has been financed by America. That sort of America has somehow managed to persuade 1 million people that the extradition law, which astonishingly have an incredibly detailed knowledge of, even though they can't spell the name of the chief executive of Hong Kong, that somehow America has somehow just managed to fool all these massive numbers of people into getting involved in a movement that really isn't in their interests. And that comes, I think, back to then the question about the nationalist tendencies in China, because which is not new, because really ever since 1979, when the new reform agenda started inside China, they've been downgrading the sort of the formal language of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. We are building socialism, so they're quite explicitly talking about the market economy, quite explicitly talking about world economy. But what they've retained is nationalism. So and it's a key thing that links the key ideological mechanism, if you like, that links the rulers with the majority of the population is that sense of Chinese nationalism. And it's a complicated, contradictory nationalism, because it's partly obviously built on the fact that China was for 100 years colonized, pushed around by all major world imperialist powers. But on the other hand, China had once upon a time been an empire in its own right. So Chinese nationalism, all nationalism is contradictory, obviously. Chinese nationalism is contradictory in a very particular, way. And I think there are strands of the other thing about Maoism is that Maoism is now being used as a rallying point to oppose the current government in China. Essentially on the basis of back in Mao's day everyone was equal, back in Mao's day everyone had the same Mao's, now look at inequality. And so quite a lot of the the organisation around migrant workers' rights, for instance, quite a lot of that is being done by people who think of themselves as Maoists, but also explicitly opposed to the current regime in China. Start coming back to one of the Ian's right about the dominant ways that the term neoliberalism has been used. And if you think about, in Chile, it began with wholesale military coup. In America, it began with Reagan breaking the airline pilots, which was very explicitly not about, deregulating the airline industry, but this is how any trade union will be treated. In Britain, the salami tactics followed by the frontal attack on the miners. And in a sense, the term, at the time, it made more sense to talk about neoliberalism is what governments are doing, globalisation is what is happening to the world economy, and neoliberalism has sort of slowly come to be a term that sort of encompasses all of that. And, yes, I think there is a move away from that in different points and different parts. And it's right to say that it is very difficult to see how a shift away from that will work for capitals who are fully globally integrated, in the same way as it's, very difficult to see how Brexit is going to work, for instance, for, sort of car manufacturers whose production processes are integrated across Europe. But I think the point is when we say, we don't know how it's going to work, they don't know how it's going to work either. We tend to underestimate the extent to which 2008 broke the idea that there is a simple thing called the interests of British capitalism, the interests of American capitalism, the interests of Chinese capitalism, because the reality is 2008 sort of said basically everything you've done over the last 20 years leads to this. And how do you get out of that? And no one knows. So trying to work, and in a sense, because no one knows, bits of sections of capital are willing to look to more extreme solutions or suggestions that they would not have countenanced 15 or 20 years ago. If Trump had gone up against either of the Bushes in 1990s, he would have got nowhere. If Trump had gone up against Clinton in 1990s, he would have got nowhere. Now, yes, it sounds ludicrous, but no one has, who's got a better answer? Hillary Clinton? Remembering something that I'm trying to think who it was. Someone saying about, again, going back, Brexit, Dominic Cummings. One of the things that Dominic Cummings has learned about politics is the advantage of being utterly ruthless. It doesn't matter much what you're being utterly ruthless about, but that sense of knowing, giving the sense that you know what you're doing and you're not going to stop until you get it, does give a sense of this person has the interests of capital, this person has a sense of the interests of capital, even if you think they're completely out to lunch. And so that's why I think that protectionist politicians can come to be more dominant, because no one has a much better idea. No one has a better idea. And again, if you like, in a sense, in the States, that's exemplified by the state of the Democratic Party, because you look at what Trump has done, you look at the scale of the opposition to him, you think what it really ought, the next election ought to be taken for granted that the Democrats will win. And you look at the numbskulls and no-hopers that they're putting forward to try and stop Sanders getting nomination, and you think, well, if Trump goes up against some of that Joe Biden, you can't guarantee that Trump's going to lose. So I think we are in a very fluid situation, and the reality is that the populists have grabbed onto one thing, which, because they have that certainty, it's allowing them to pull lots of people behind them. And of course, that is, that in a sense is Putin's USP. I know what I'm doing. I am assertive about Russia's interests, and whether or not what Putin actually does meets the best interests of Russian capital or not, the point is that he managed to give the sense that he's embodying that. So China and Russia are going to bump up against each other in Africa to a limited extent, but it's important to remember, given the extent to which Western capital has disengaged from Africa over the last 30 or 40 years, actually there is an awful lot of Africa for China and Trump to work in without, China and Russia to work in without necessarily bumping into each other. China and Russia both have an interest in seeing seeing the power of America diminished, and they're working very closely together over, say, both the Belt and Road Initiative and also things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Paradoxically, one of the biggest clashes between them, the other I mentioned, really do need to take into account this, is India. Because of course China's biggest neighbour to the south is also China's most hostile international relationship, and Russia and India are very close. So you've got all of these slightly different factors working their way through. The anti-American thing is, I think, for now dominant, but you're right. At the point where America fades, or at the point where they come into conflict with each other in Africa, then you're going to see the strains and the stresses between China and Russia opening up again. Or of course, if the stresses between China and India open up again, that will then put stress on the relationship with Russia as well. A couple of things. Okay, well, you see, you say it was simpler before 1989, but I have quite a vivid memory of the Indian emergency of 1975. Indira Gandhi introduced the state of emergency, something like 100,000 people arrested, huge numbers of trade unions effectively closed down, massive repression across the whole of the country. I stood up in the Students' Union general meeting to talk about the iniquities of that, because just over the summer I talked to someone in my hometown whose entire family, who involved in the Communist Party of India Marxists, had been caught up in the arrests. The Communist Party of India supported the crackdown, and a member of the Communist Party, not a bad person, a member of the Communist Party, stood up immediately after I'd spoken and defended Indira Gandhi's coup, and did so in a way that actually managed to sway the meeting. So it wasn't always that obvious. I also have an equally vivid memory, actually from 2 rooms away in Leeds University, of realising that had fundamentally been broken. And that was at a conference called Beyond the Fragments, which had been organised with quite strong Communist Party support, where someone got up and talked about supporting the Gdansk shipyard workers who had just gone into occupation, and the entire hall went into applause. And at that point I thought, okay, that's a break. And I think part of the problem is simply the lack of that sense of workers' activity from below. And we're starting to see, I think, revive that with Hong Kong. Yes, it's, I'm having arguments with a couple of people about, Hong Kong is, the thing in Hong Kong is pro-American, is funded by workers. There's a couple of people. The overwhelming majority of people I'm in contact with, face-to-face or through Facebook, can see this for what it is, an uprising against an oppressive regime, with all the contradictions. So I think that part of the reason for that is simply that lack of mobilisation from below. That what's important in politics comes to be seen as governments and which side governments are on, and whether governments are pro-American, in which case any movement against them is to be welcomed, or whether those governments are anti-American, in which case, oh, it's very complicated. There's so many different people fighting in Syria. We can't possibly do, and are you sure they're dropping barrel bomb? You know, all the. But the other, and I think there's also something about the withering of the mass roots of the anti-war movement, which meant that the people who hung on in it, in the anti-war movement, were by and large the campists who got to have an undue influence, and for whom people further to left who should have known better went along, dragged along with them because again of a perverted conception of what the United Front is, which is the United Front is you don't say anything nasty about your allies. Well, actually, when we think about some things that we all know about, the United Front starts with saying, understanding that you're going to be critical of you're working for the same end, but within that you're saying different things. And I think, so two things. Firstly, the more you get movements from below, the less you see that the more that campist idea tends to dissipate, because people are forced to say, am I really going to stand against what looks like a genuine mass movement? And for most of them, no, they're not going to. But secondly, I think we also have to go back to sort of some basic ideas about what the United Front entails and how you work with people while maintaining the ability to criticise in some ways. There used to be the phrase working with and against, which I don't think is particularly a good one, because you're not necessarily working against people, but you're just saying you're wrong about that. But let's do this together. And then we also have to go back to a more basic understanding of imperialism as a world system, which is really where it came in. That the world system of imperialism is being recast by China, but it's being recast in a different form, with the rise of a dominant power that's challenging America's hegemony, but is not challenging the system of imperialism that continues to oppress and exploit us.